Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Granja Paraiso 92 Anaerobic Wash Process Colombia from People Possession. And there's the can right there. And People Possession, based out of Paris, France. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the Sammy B, a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. And as is usually the case when reviewing a brand new roaster for the first time, I like to review one of their washed and one of their non-washed offerings, as there are very few things more opposite of a wash processed Ethiopian coffee than one of Wilton Benitez's coffees. So we will see how this side of People Possession's offerings turns out, as this right here is day 54. And we really pushed the recipe on this one at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the Chemex, which typically indicates a more medium grind. However, with this one, we went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, as I mentioned in our previous People Possession review, their coffees do remind me a fair bit of some of the other Parisian-based coffee roasters we've had, most notably Kawa in the past. And in addition to that, this coffee actually reminded me of some of the more experimental omni-roasted coffees that we've had from Fried Hats as well. So that's all to say that this coffee definitely remains on the lighter side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 29 first impression, and we ran it through the V60 with the cup offering a classical Wilton Benitez-like aspect to it with a very wild profile and a slightly fermented candy sense. And I kind of joked around that maybe we should have Wilton Benitez coffees as a flavor note profile to a coffee, because there's a very notable and wild, intense aspect to a lot of Wilton Benitez's coffees, and that's certainly the case with this one as well, with the cool down opening up a more wild grape-like candy aspect and a very strong citric component to it, lending itself towards an okay first impression. And I think a lot of people know that these overly heavy, overly intense coffees aren't usually my favorite, but we're going to see what we can do with this one, as on day 32 we ran it through the Chemex and it was offering a little bit more in terms of the heaviness with a classical grape sense to it as well. Plenty of the intense berry aspects with a citric attribute also felt in a very lingering and long-lasting sense, with the finish continuing to offer a lot of intensity. So as fully anticipated, this coffee was very intense right from the onset. Day 35 through the April brewer, and the cup is continuing to offer more of the intense berry aspects again. It is reminiscent of other iterations of the Wilton Benitez coffees we've had in the past, with a strong fermented candied aspect to it, a strong lingering citrus, and that fermentiness coming in a little bit more of that mango-like sense. Day 38 through the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments, and I really just said with this coffee, you know what, let's lean into it, because that's often the case when it comes to these coffees, as in the past I've tried to tone these coffees down, but I said, let's just see what we can get from this one, and that's what we did. And interestingly, it was a little better, as there was still an abundance of that Wilton Benitez-like funkiness to it, with the citric aspects being the strongest, but also a spiced quality that was very much in line with the listed ginger. And I'm not the biggest fan of ginger, not the biggest fan of overly intense coffees, I'm not the biggest fan of citrus, but even then I said, this is at least a little better, getting a little bit more depth and a slight bit more definition to this one. Day 41 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was perhaps a slight bit cleaner than the previous day, with it continuing to offer immense sweetness and intensity, but still slightly better clarity and definition all around. The listed fruit punch felt very apt, as there was a strong punchy quality to it with a cotton candy-like sugariness. So very sweet, very intense. We move on to day 44 as we ran it through the V60 yet again with the higher extraction adjustments, and the cup does continue to offer strong intensity with the Wilton Benitez coffee-like aspects yet again in terms of that strong fruit flavor in a very funky and fermented sense, reminiscent at this time of what I would describe as being grape Kool-Aid with more of that strong citric brightness. Day 47 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's really hard to differentiate between which brew method I had a preference towards, as there's an extremely strong dark fruit intensity on this day as well. Heavy through this brew method, and there's a slight bit more definition, which was probably the biggest trade-off I had between the two brew methods and why I had a slight preference towards the Chemex. As we went back to it on day 50, and it continues to offer that immense intensity with a really strong sugariness reminiscent of what I've described as the following: grape Kool-Aid, cotton candy, listed fruit punch. There's also more of that spiced quality, that ginger-like sense to it, a bitter fruit aspect, which I could describe once again as being an unripened pineapple, and then the fermented mango with a slight wininess, all in a very long-lasting and lingering sense. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel. I'm sure you guys are excited about this one, so you can't see what we're getting. We have 5 level 5s. So let's go through those, and we'll start with the finish, level 5. That in no way is a surprise whatsoever. As I mentioned from the very first day, that this one has a very long-lasting sense to it, and the rest of the things that we're going to discuss are representative of that very long-lasting aspect to it. And that is the sweetness and the brightness, the berry fruit and the citric fruit. So I think we can kind of discuss all of these together for the most part, as it's that overly intense sugariness, that overly intense strong fruit aspect to it, that overly funky, fermenty, just intensity overall in a much brighter sense. So the sweetness, level 5, I mentioned a bunch of just ridiculously sugary things that come out in a very artificial sense, and that's very prominent and pronounced in this one, and that's why it's as high as it is in that sweeter sense. And I've said in the past that when the finish and the sweetness both score at that level 5, it's usually because it's a little overbearing and heavy for me. That's going to be the case with this one, as these things were just a little bit too intense for my liking. Acidity level 5. As mentioned, the brightness was a little bit skewed. It just kind of seems to go over, and I think when that's coupled with a very intense, sweeter, long-lasting finish to the coffee, it's not necessarily ideal for me. So all of those things scoring there at that level 5, coupled with the berry fruit there at that level 5. As I mentioned, there's that strong Colombian aspect to it. I was fully expecting that. Once again, we are working with an experimentally processed Colombian coffee, and as a result, you can, I shouldn't say experimentally, but heavier processed Colombian coffee. And for that reason, you can definitely expect that berry notes to score pretty high, and it's no surprise to me that it scored at that level 5. I think looking at that fruit punch note, I said, yeah, we're probably going to be dealing with a lot of strong red aspects to it. But in addition to that, I could say that there were a lot of strong purple aspects to it. Just thinking of notes, it kind of reminds me of that fruit punch like Gatorade too. And in addition to that, we had the citrus fruit scoring there at that level 5. And I can't recall whether or not they had any sort of citric notes on here, but it would be really surprising to me if they didn't, because this one just had a very long-lasting and intense citric quality right from the onset, and the entirety of the time that you're drinking this coffee, it's just felt in very strong abundance throughout. We still have a handful of other notes, so we'll go through the surprisingly just one level 4, which is that spiced quality. And I mentioned briefly that there's a ginger-like aspect to it, and yeah, I can kind of see it being like a ginger soda, as there's a strong herbality to it. And this thing, scoring that level 4 is just a testament to how strong and intense that was, mostly because the other things scoring there at that level 5, those things were just so in your face that anything that's scoring at a level 4 also has to be pretty prominent and pronounced as well, and that was the case with the spiced quality of this one. Correction, there's a second level 4, and that's the stone fruit being there at the level 4. That fermented mango aspect, it pales in comparison to the other intense fruit qualities within this one, but even then I said it's felt quite a bit in abundance on this coffee. I think they have a yellow fruit note list on here. I think that's what they're insinuating. Nonetheless, it's very much in that fermented sense. Handful of level 3s, we'll start with the florality level 3, and I would say a little bit more of a generic floral sense to it, as I couldn't necessarily pick up anything overly definitive, but I think given that there was a very strong herbal spiced quality to this one, I'm like, yeah, I can see plenty of florals in it as well. Saltiness, level 3. As making this tasting wheel, I said, there's a very intense salty aspect to this coffee as well, and I think that has to go into play with the rest of this, because anytime you look at these tasting wheels, you have to keep it in context of where all the other things are scoring. So all of these things at the level 5 are just that intense that anything even scoring at a level 3 has to be pretty pronounced in this coffee as well for it to be picked up. Caramel, level 3. As mentioned, there's a very strong sugary sense to this one, and I can see that in a number of ways. But even then, you could probably justify bumping it up to level 4. The main reason I couldn't is mostly because, once again, the other aspects in this coffee are so overbearing and intense that one right there, while still prominent and pronounced, isn't anywhere near those other qualities. Bitterness, level 4. As mentioned, there's a bitter fruit quality to this one as well. A lot of unripened fruit, it feels like, so that plays a significant role in it. Savoriness, level 3. As mentioned, there's that spiced herbal quality that's also present within this coffee that gives it a little bit of a contrasting feel to the very intense fruit components to it. Body, level 3, it had a fair bit of texture to it as well with all of these things that we've mentioned, so that's just one other thing to add into this tasting wheel. Man, I feel like we've gone through all of the notes, but the last thing really worth discussing is the cleanliness, level 2. And I think going into it, you could fully expect it to score level 1, especially the way I've discussed this coffee. But as mentioned, there's definition to it. I've had funkier, I've had more fermenty, I've had more intense coffees that offer a little less clarity and definition to them. And while this one obviously isn't going to be the most clean coffee, there were times where I said, I can pick out all of these notes, and it has so many things that can go against it. So I mentioned a slight bit of wininess, the overly skewed acidity, as well as the fermentiness, the funkiness. It has all of those things. But at the end of the day, it has enough definition to bump it up there to that level 2. But I could be fine if somebody placed it at that level 1, because this thing might be a little bit too, well, just say muddled because of the very intense aspects that are present within it. But I'll settle on that level 2. Outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've had a lot of Wilton Benitez's coffees since they first started, I guess, being a little bit more of a prominent producer in the coffee world. And there isn't any of the coffees that I've necessarily been a big fan of, mostly because they continue to skew in this direction. And it goes the same thing with Diego Bermudez's coffees, with some exceptions here or there. When they do tend to skew in this very intense, overbearing direction, it's not going to be the type of coffee that I specifically enjoy, given that I very much prioritize cleanliness and clarity for all of my coffees. So it's not surprising whatsoever that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of this one. And I'll be completely honest, I did have a little bit of a difficult time continuing to drink this one. But I think at the end of the day, it was just kind of interesting to pick out all of the things that are present within it, because I know people enjoy these coffees, and the reason they enjoy them is because of how intense they are. And for me, I said, this is an exhibition in just picking out an abundance of things, because there are so many flavors in this coffee, even if they're not necessarily flavors that I enjoy, as I can't necessarily say that there was anything in this coffee that is in line with my own preferences. Too intense, too sweet, too overbearing, too long lasting, too bright, and all of these things just kind of going against the profile that I typically enjoy in my own type of coffees. That kind of transitions into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Those people that have enjoyed these very intense Wilton Benitez coffees in the past. If you do like all of the intensity kind of ramped up to that level 5, I want to point you in the direction of this one. And I know there are a lot of coffees now out there these days that offer that, but I think what might set this one apart is that contrasting and interesting spiced herbal quality. In addition to that, there's so many sugary aspects as well that maybe at times you can get a little bit of a one definition kind of cherry cordial, very heavy, intense berry notes to it. While this one right here offered just, I would say, other sugary aspects, a cotton candy-like feel, a Kool-Aid-like feel, that fruit punch-like feel, all of which in, I would say, a very sweet and pronounced manner. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Granja Paraiso 92 Anaerobic Wash Process Colombia from People Possession. Thank you for watching.